Is Lori Lightfoot a reformer?
Let's find out.
If you've been watching this web series long enough, you'll know that I have a lot of friends working on different campaigns. Lori Lightfoot is no exception, but I'm going to keep this fair.
Lori first got in the news as a law student at the University of Chicago.
She successfully got a law firm suspended from recruiting at UChicago after one of its partners allegedly made racist, sexist, and anti-Semitic remarks while recruiting a student.
Her first job in the public sector was in 1996 as the assistant U.S. attorney who handled cases in bankruptcy fraud, public corruption, and violent crimes. During this time, she faced a career-threatening disciplinary case that I'll go more into in just a minute.
But as a prosecutor, she did help convict former Alderman Virgil Jones of taking a $7,000 bribe. This was part of a bigger FBI investigation into Chicago's political corruption in the 90s called Operation Silver Shovel. It's tough to talk about Silver Shovel. On one hand, it handed out corruption charges to 18 individuals, 6 of whom were current or former aldermen. On the other hand, most of the targets of Silver Shovel were Black or Latino. U.S. Attorney Jim Byrd's office was mostly run by white men, so they may have been insensitive to communities of color. But part of the reason she said that she joined the U.S. Attorney's office in the first place was because she saw that the office was, in her words, almost exclusively white males, and that people of color needed to be represented. I think that's really cool.
In 2002, Mayor Rich Daley appointed Lori to be the chief administrator of the Office of Professional Standards, or OPS. OPS was the disciplinary arm of the police department that had serious issues that I'll go into, but Lori did have an accomplishment here.
In March 2003, on a red line CTA station, an officer shot an unarmed man in the head. The entire incident was caught on security video. The police department said that the shooting was justified because the officer was defending himself. Lightfoot and OPS disagreed. There was a shooting that I thought was cold-blooded murder, and I called it that, and made a recommendation that the officer should be fired. There was no provocation for the use of deadly force.
The security footage was eventually made public, and the police department's defense of self-defense was eventually found to be false. In 2005, Mayor Rich Daley brought in Lori in City Hall's procurement department where big city contracts were reviewed.
Lori found success in taking on politically powerful targets, including big builders and important fundraisers for the mayor himself. But this made Rich Daley upset, and he thought that Lori and the department went too far.
If you make Rich Daley mad for too much reform, that's an accomplishment in my books. Lori went on to be a senior equity partner at the law firm Mayer Brown, but in 2015 was brought in by Rahm to be the president of the Chicago Police Board. Before Lori, the board had a reputation for being easy on bad cops, but under Lori's leadership, the board terminated officers in 72% of the cases it heard.
Months into her tenure came a horrific incident. Laquan McDonald's police murder by Officer Jason Van Dyke. Rahm tried to do damage control and appointed Lori to be the chair of the newly created Police Accountability Task Force.
The task force was very critical of the Chicago police. They called for the superintendent to acknowledge the police force's history of racial disparity and discrimination. They called for sweeping changes in oversight and training. And they called to replace the Independent Police Review Authority, a disciplinary agency that was found to be ineffective. Rahm replaced it with the better-funded Civilian Office of Police Accountability.
So I just went through Lori's career only talking about accomplishments. Let's do it again from the beginning, this time with concerns.
As a federal prosecutor early in her career, Lori got into some trouble.
In 1997, a Norwegian court found a guy named Lars Erik Lindstrom guilty of fraud and sentenced him to prison. He fled to the United States, and the Norwegian government requested the US to send him back to Norway. This is called extradition. As a federal prosecutor, Lori was put in charge of this case.
On the day Lars was scheduled to be extradited, he was handed to a US Marshal and 2 Norwegian police officers who took him to O'Hare Airport. But 3 hours before takeoff, a federal appeals judge put the extradition on hold so Lars could keep fighting it.
Lori consulted with her superiors and filed a motion to ask the federal judge to reverse the order. But she didn't mention that she had advised the US Marshal that the judge's order was moot since Lars had already been handed over to Norwegian custody.
By the time the federal judge denied Lori's request to reverse the order, Lars's plane had taken off and the US legal system lost jurisdiction over him.
Richard Posner, a judge on the 7th US Circuit Court of Appeals, led a disciplinary hearing. He concluded that Lori had misled the federal judge and called her actions professional misconduct and said that she had gotten bad advice from her superiors.
But because Lori had glowing reviews about her competence and character, she only got a reprimand. Still, getting a reprimand from a federal judge is pretty rare. The Justice Department took the incident serious enough to do an internal investigation and concluded that Lori had not engaged in professional misconduct or exercised poor judgment.
This was obviously not a great moment in her career, but quite frankly, the more I read about it, the less it matters to me when it comes to her ability to be our mayor. People are twisting this incident to make it seem like Lori is anti-immigration, but this case isn't an example of that. But there are real concerns in Lori's record.
3 years after her time at the Office of Professional Standards, the Tribune did an investigation and found that OPS had a pattern of cursory investigations, often doing no more than basic reviews of police reports. Lori says that she did make recommendations to terminate officers for bad policing, but that those recommendations were rejected because the office was technically an arm of the department she was charged with investigating. But there was an incident when she did the opposite.
When she started as the head of OPS, she inherited the case of Officer Phyllis Klingscales shooting a 17-year-old teenager. OPS investigators at the time found that Klingscales had lied to them about several details and recommended firing the officer. Lori's predecessor found that the shooting was unjustified and approved the firing.
But after some objections from the superintendent and the chief of patrol, Lori's predecessor changed the punishment from terminating the officer to a suspension. But when Lori became the head of OPS, she upheld the suspension but reversed the investigation's findings. She ruled the shootings as justified. Lori won't comment on that case without reviewing case files that aren't readily available anymore. Not okay.
In 1991, Lori was part of a legal team that represented Republicans who thought that the Illinois congressional districts were unfairly drawn. And then after the 2010 census, Lori represented Illinois Republicans again in a lawsuit claiming that the congressional districts were unfairly drawn. Today, Lori defends her work by saying that the map disenfranchised Latino voters.
In 2009, during her time at Mayor Brown, she also represented police officer Paul Powers, who, along with 2 other off-duty officers, got in a bar fight with 4 men. The 3 officers were found not guilty. And in 2012, Ron brought Lori in to be the lead attorney to represent Chicago in a lawsuit filed by the family of Christina Eilman. This story is really sad.
In 2006, Christina Eilman was arrested in Midway Airport for an incident that was attributed to her mental health. I'll let the Tribune explain what happened. Held overnight by Chicago police, Eilman was released without assistance several miles away in a high-crime neighborhood, where she was abducted and sexually assaulted before plummeting from the 7th-floor window of a public housing high-rise. The case was eventually settled for $22.5 million, one of the largest settlements to a single defendant in Chicago history.
Moving on to her time as the president of the Chicago Police Board, although Lori had successes, it's impossible not to mention her handling of Dante Servin's murder of Rekia Boyd.
Dante Servin was an off-duty police officer who in 2012 got in an altercation and shot into a crowd, killing unarmed and innocent Rekia Boyd. Dante Servin thought that someone had pointed a gun in his direction, but it turned out to be a cell phone.
He was charged with manslaughter, which in 2015 Judge Dennis Porter threw out because prosecutors failed to show that Dante Servin acted recklessly. Judge Porter said that Servin's decision to shoot Boyd was intentional, thus beyond recklessness. So Dante Servin couldn't have committed manslaughter and should have been charged for first-degree murder.
Dante Servin was acquitted. It's difficult for me to handle how wrong this was. I can't imagine how the family felt. Though both the Independent Police Review Authority and eventually even Police Superintendent Gary McCarthy recommended Dante Servin be fired, he was able to keep his job.
This is when things don't look good for Lori or the police board.
The board announced that it would hear Dante Servin's public hearing on May 19, 2016. This was 6 months after former police superintendent Gary McCarthy caved and recommended that Dante Servin be fired.
Activists understandably asked a key question. Why was it taking so long to start the process of holding Dante Servin accountable for his murder?
Black Youth 100, an organization of Black activists and organizers, had an explanation. Lori Lightfoot and her colleagues are satisfied with holding off on a ruling on the firing of Dante Servin, hoping that the families and the communities that they come from get tired and discouraged and go back to their over-policed and disinvested communities. I reached out to the Lightfoot campaign to see if they had a comment to make. Here's what they said. There was a criminal case and an internal investigation before the case got to the police board. Once the case got to the board, it moved and was set for an evidentiary hearing. Before she was president of the police board, cases often got delayed for years, meaning officers were not held accountable for their actions and systemic issues in CPD persisted. The campaign is right. Cases often were delayed for years. But I think even Lori would agree that being better than that isn't exactly holding yourself to the highest of standards. By November 2015, you had a judge basically say that the shooting was first-degree murder, the IPRA recommended firing Dante Servin, and the superintendent of the police agreeing with the recommendation. And it still took 6 months to even get the hearing process started? I can understand why activists don't think that Lori can bring in true police reform. Dante Servin resigned 2 days before his hearing. His pension was not affected.
In my opinion, Lori Lightfoot is a complicated figure.
She has a record of standing up to her powerful bosses in City Hall and does have accomplishments in police reform during her time in the police board and in the Police Accountability Task Force. But you can't overlook her defensive officers during her time at Mayor Brown or her work at the ineffectual Office of Professional Standards. And her broken relationship with activists and communities whose voices are systematically marginalized is deeply concerning.
This is me speculating, so please take it with a giant grain of salt. Lori seems to be a pragmatist who has worked best reforming inside the system. But maybe we need someone who has a vision to overhaul the system we have. That's a genuine question for you to decide.
Thank you so much for watching. If you believe that more people should learn about Lori Lightfoot, please share this video. And if you believe in the mission of this web series of educating Chicago voters, please consider donating to my Patreon. Every dollar goes a really long way because I'm working on this full time and the show is entirely funded by you, the audience. There's going to be one more video before the election on February 26th, so keep an eye out for that. Until next time.